Okay, so now that we've taken a look at the approach we're going to take to rendering, I'm now going to come over into Houdini and set up our shadow take. And this shadow take is going to allow us to tell the renderer to temporarily switch over to a state where it's going to render all the shadows into the alpha channel of our image, as opposed to rendering diffuse or specular passes. And to do this, we're going to need to create a Vex Shadow Matte shader. We're going to need to assign that to our objects, but we only need to assign that to our objects when we're in the shadow take. So what we're going to do is create some materials that are unassigned for the most part. We're going to set up our shadow take, and then when we're in that take, we're going to assign our Vex Shadow Matte to those materials. Now, since we're dealing with a project level, I'm going to jump over to the shop context, and I'm going to create our Vex Shadow Matte shader over in this context. I'm going to push Tab to bring up our tab menu. I'm going to type Vex Shadow Matte. Enter to accept that, enter to place that in our scene, and we don't need to change any of the parameters of the shadow matte. It's going to work just straight out of the box. So with our shadow matte created, I'm going to jump back over to the object context, and I'm going to deal with setting up material SOPs where we can assign this material. Now let's come over here, and it's worth talking about why we need to do this. Well, let's take a look at our floor. And our floor at object level does have a material parameter, and we could go in here and say and specify the shadow matte at the object level. The problem with this is that it appears from all the tests that we've done that the object level material is overridden by any of the SOP level materials that we've specified. So even if we were to specify our shadow matte here at object level, our floor material would still get rendered with. So what we need to do is go in at SOP level and assign the material. But if we were to jump inside our asset and assign the material here, we'd have to unlock our asset, and then we'd have to deal with assigning the material. And also, some of our assets have multiple material SOPs that we'd need to assign to. A much easier approach is to take the output of our asset and wire that into a new material SOP. So let's take that and wire into a material SOP. And if we simply leave the material parameter unspecified on this material SOP, it's not going to affect any of our material settings. So the materials we've set down inside our asset are still going to hold here. However, as soon as we go ahead and assign our shadow matte into this material slot, that will then take over, because any geometry coming out then gets that material assigned as the last stage, so that's going to be its shader that it's actually rendered with. So what we can do is we can leave this blank for when we're in the main take, and then we can go ahead and create a shadow take and assign our shadow matte into this material slot. Before we do that, I do want to go ahead and add materials to all of our other objects. The only object we won't be adding a material to will be our character, since our character is an object level asset. So we jump inside, we need to wire a material off the end, and if we're going to do that, we might as well just use the material SOP that's already in there. So we've created a material for our floor, so let's jump in and create one for our stage. So I've jumped into our stage, I'm going to right click on the output of our stage asset, create another material SOP, drop that in and make sure we set our visibility to the material SOP. Jump up, I'm going to jump down inside our pool, right click on the output, create another material SOP, enter to drop that into our network. Make sure that the visibility is set to the material, so that's our floor, stage, pool. Let's set our ladder, wire that into a material. I'm grabbing material from the history that is actually off the bottom of the screen there, so single left click on that, enter to drop that in. Make sure we set our visibility down onto the material. We've then got our audience, all of the stadium and the various columns for the audience, so let's jump in and get those set up. So I'm going to take our file and wire that into a material, set the visibility down, and I'm going to do that on all of the audience columns as well. So right click on the output of the file, create a new material SOP, drop that in, set our visibility to it. Let's repeat for all our other columns. So create a new material, set our visibility, create a new material, set our visibility, new material, set our visibility, and finally right click, create a new material, enter to drop that into our network, set our visibility, and jump back up to object level, again recalling that we're going to use the existing material SOP in our character asset to enable us to set the shadow matte for our character. So that's our floor, stage, pool, ladder. We'll deal with the character separately, and all of our audience and the stadium. Now before we switch over and start creating takes, I do want to allow editing of the character asset content so we can actually go in and assign the shadow matte. So I'm going to right click on our character and come down to allow editing of contents, just so that we can go in and we can actually change this material parameter. So right now we haven't actually changed anything. If we were to render out now, and I don't know how well lighting is going to enable us to see this, but hopefully we've still got all of our shaders assigned to all of our objects. We haven't removed anything, even though we've assigned the material onto the end of each of these assets or the files that are bringing in the geometry. However, we can go ahead and we can create a take where we go in and set our shadow map shader that we've just created as the material on all of these material slots we created, and that will override all of this, and you'll see that the shadow map shader is assigned to everyone. To do that, we're going to use something called takes. Houdini's takes allow us to take whatever the current state of our scene happens to be and kind of branch off from that and say, okay, take whatever this particular state happens to be, but make these specified changes. So what we're going to do, we've got our main take, and that's everything that we've created so far. Everything we've done so far in this project has been in the main take. We can go ahead and we can say, create a new take that branches off from the main take. And if we come over to our take list, I can double click or single click and rename this to shadow take. This name is going to become incredibly important when we switch over and write our script. I'm assuming that this name is named exactly as this, shadow take, with the T being capital, because I'm going to reference this directly inside our Python script we're going to create later. So now we've got the shadow take, and that's branched off of main, and what that means is until we make changes, the shadow take has the exact same parameters that the main take has because it's branched off of main. But we can go in, and while we're under the shadow take, we can go in and we can start changing some of those parameters. And you'll see that when we select, I switch back over to our parameters, any of our nodes, everything's grayed out. But what we can do, let's say the material for our stadium import, we can right click and we can say include this in the take. Now we have the ability to change this. So now we can say, okay, browse to the shadow map material that we've created, and that's going to assign the shadow map to our stadium. We can see the result that that's had in the viewport. If we switch back over to the main take, we haven't made that change. As soon as we're into the shadow take, we say, okay, take everything that we've already set up in main, but make this change, activate this material, and assign the shadow match shader to this object. So now, while we're still in the shadow take, we can go ahead and do the same for all of our other objects. So I'm going to jump down inside audience column 0, include that in the take, specify our shadow map, and accept. And you can see our audience has been included. Jump back up, jump down inside our audience column 1, include that material in the take, and set to the shadow map. I'm going to repeat this for the rest of our audience columns, so include in take, shadow map, jump back up, jump inside our audience column 3, include in take, shadow map, jump back up, jump back inside audience column 4, include in take, and shadow map. Let's do the same for our floor, so let's come and hunt down our floor, jump inside, include our material for our floor in the take, assign our shadow map shader. Let's do the same for our stage, so let's come inside, include our material parameter in the take, and assign our shadow map shader. Let's do the same for our pool, so let's jump inside, include that in the take, and assign our shadow map. And let's do that for our ladder, so include it in take, assign the shadow map. Finally, we're going to assign the shadow map to our character, and we're going to deal with this slightly differently, as mentioned a second ago. We can jump inside our character and we can find the existing material SOP that we created, include that in the take, which is currently set to be our m_character. We can simply replace that out with our shadow map. And you'll notice that we've replaced that out with the shadow map. If we switch back to our main take, we go back to our original character material. So all we said is, when we switch over to the shadow take this material and change it to be this. We haven't affected anything set over in the main take. So now if we're in the main take, we're seeing all of our shaders as before. If we switch over into the shadow take, we've assigned that new shadow map material. And what's that going to do when we render? Well, let's come in and jump over to our output context and create, let's come over to main and create a mantra render node and tell it to render using that shadow take, which is what we're going to do with our script. So now it's going to be as if we set our scene over to the shadow take and then we render whatever's in our scene. And with this mantra render node, I'm going to set us to be our shot02 camera. So we can set our camera for the render node to be shot02, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth, but we have covered this before in fundamentals. But here I'm just setting it up so we can actually render and see the effects. You don't actually need to follow along and create this render node if you're watching the video. So we're going to specify our shot02 camera, so we're going to be looking through here. And if we were to render now,
Let's go ahead and make sure that we've got the lights turned on right when he takes that deep breath as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Otherwise, we're not going to see shadows. Well, we'll see shadows from the secondary lights, probably. So let's jump to here. So now we know our lights are going to be turned on. And if we now tell this render node to render, it's rendering with the shadow take, which means we're not going to see anything in our color channel because of the fact that everything is going to be rendered out black. And that's actually going to be very useful when we come to composite this particular pass in. So our color channel renders out black. However, the magic happens when we switch over to our alpha channel. We get our shadows now appearing in our alpha channel, which means we now have the shadow information on its own. So you see, through setting up this take, we temporarily set us into a state where we use the shadow match shader, which is perfect for us because that allows us to render out our shadows into the alpha channel. So I'm going to delete out this mantra node that we just created, and with that, that's going to conclude creating the shadow take. In the next video, we're going to start taking a look at how we're going to write our Python script.